or lose your job. And today's OSHA rule, very long time coming, we were waiting for it, that was issued. If you look at it, here it is. It's almost 500 pages. And so we're supposed to be a government of laws, not a government of men. This is 500 pages of a government of a bureaucracy, a government that is being run by executive edict, not in accordance with the typical constitutional processes. And the state of Florida is going to respond, and we will combat the OSHA rule. As soon as it's published, the state of Florida will be joining with Georgia and Alabama, as well as private plaintiffs, to file suit. This is a rule that is not consistent with the Constitution and is not legally authorized through congressional statutes. There is no federal police power. The federal government can't just unilaterally impose medical policy under the guise of workplace regulation, and that is exactly what they're trying to do here. They don't provide any instances why the workplace is somehow different than anything else that's been done with any of this. This is an attempt to shoehorn policy through the bureaucracy in a way that will be difficult for some of these individuals and private parties to resist. I think it's interesting that this is being done under the guise of emergency power. This was announced 2 months ago, and it said this is an emergency and that this is grave danger is facing. Then why did it take you 2 months to issue the rule? And then, of course, the rule doesn't take effect until January, which is convenient because it's not going to, it'll minimize workforce disruptions over the holiday season, which we know we're likely to see anyways, and then this would only exacerbate that. So this is not consistent with a government of limited and enumerated powers. There is no general police power. There's no power to mandate on the American people from the federal government. People will sometimes point out about state mandates and how those have been imposed through the years and have the constitutionality has been upheld. States clearly have a general police power, whatever the wisdom of a particular mandate is. It's much different when the federal government is imposing that on tens of millions of Americans, particularly without any legislative sanction. At the end of the day, individuals should make informed choices about their own health care. They shouldn't be coerced into getting a jab. In this situation, you're going to have people that are going to have to make that decision. Do you get fired from your job, or do you do this if this may be something that you don't think is something that you want to do? And just be clear with what OSHA is doing. They're clearly not doing science because they reject immunity through prior infection. They reject the Israel study and all the very strong studies that have come out that show people that have recovered from COVID have strong protection. They totally cast that aside, and they make no accommodation or acknowledgement of that in any way, shape, or form. But ultimately, people should be able to make these decisions. I don't think people want this decision yanked away from them. I don't think they want to allow a precedent where the federal government could come in and just force you to do what it wants you to do. And make no mistake about it, those individuals who have gone through a normal vaccination series for COVID, you will be determined to be unvaccinated very soon. They will do that. They are going to tell you you're unvaccinated and you have to get a booster. Otherwise, you could potentially face loss of employment or other types of penalties. So that is going to happen. They're not putting that in the rule, but they're already asking for feedback on how to do this going forward. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to get more restrictive. There's going to be more power brought to bear going forward if we don't stand up now and fight back. I just think people are so sick of constantly being bossed around, restricted, mandated, all these different things. We've had enough of it, and we want people to be able to make their own decisions. And so it is important to stand up for people's individual ability to make decisions for themselves. I also think it's just the constitutionality is very significant, the individual freedom very significant, but put those even aside, what's the practical result of this? The practical result of this is this going to exacerbate a lot of the existing problems that we're seeing with the economy, particularly as it relates to the supply chain, the ability to get goods to market. This is not going to help the inflation that we've seen in the economy. I can tell you that is definitely not going to help making sure that the shelves are stocked in stores around this country. If you just take a very small fraction of, say, truckers and that they lose their jobs as a result of this, that is going to be catastrophic, and you're going to see ripple effects throughout the entire economy. So, and then just from another practical perspective, they actually say in the rule, unvaccinated people are at risk because vaccinated people can get and transmit the Delta variant. And I think that is true. But how is it better for an unvaccinated person to get fired from their job? Do you think the first thing they're going to do is run out and get the jab after they've already been fired over it? Of course they're not going to do that. I don't even see how this moves the needle in a positive direction for those folks. So this is going to cause more economic pain, and I think it's going to end up being a huge mistake. We need more people to fill a lot of these key positions, certainly in Florida, and I think in other parts of the country as well. This is only going to make it even more difficult. So, State of Florida will be filing the lawsuit, which is very, very important, and I know there'll be other states that are doing it and other courts of appeals. Because it's an OSHA challenge, it goes directly to the 11th Circuit, and so we're going to be asking for a stay of this rule, which we think is very, very important. And then, of course, we're going to be having a special legislative session starting a week from Monday, and we want to provide protections for individual employees in the state of Florida. They should not be getting fired over this. We want to make sure that that's something that's abundantly clear. We're also going to look at ways to be able to provide protections for businesses who may be subjected to potentially very harsh penalties. You know, they're going to fine people $14,000 for every single infraction. I don't know how they're going to enforce this. They're certainly not going to be able to enforce it in a way that is even-handed, and I think there's going to be huge problems with just administrability. But $14,000, you know, if you have a half dozen people, and you're supposed to maintain, the employer is actually supposed to maintain these medical records now. So you thought you just went to the job and did your job, clocked out and went home and went about your business. Now your employer is going to be in charge of making sure that they have your medical records on file for this stuff. Is that really the direction that we want to go? Is that the type of economy that we want to have? You know, I don't think so. So we are going to be able to we need to do legislative response as well. And I think that that's something that will be, I think even more so when a lot of people that have been very concerned about this, even apart from this mandate, because there are large companies who are trying to do this anyways. And people are very concerned about it, and this is something that hits very, very close to home for people. We called the legislative session. There was a lot of people that were happy about that, but I think now more people are understanding this is something that needed to be done. I mean, we've got to stand up. We've got to stand up for the constitutional order. We've got to stand up for the rights of individual Floridians and Americans, and we need to try to avoid bad policy that's going to end up hindering an already problematic national economy. And certainly in Florida, we've been able to buck some of those trends, but there's a lot of storms on the horizon, so why would we want to exacerbate that? So for all those reasons, I think people are really excited to come back here and to be able to make sure that the people of Florida have their voice heard on this. I've gone through a lot of it. I've seen some stuff. There's some interesting nuggets in here. You know, we're going to go through some more and make sure that folks are understanding kind of what's here. But they are asking for input about how much further they could go in the future. So I just want to warn people, as far-reaching as this is only the beginning for what they're contemplating doing going forward. And so there's a massive amount of federal power being exercised here, not through legislative sanction. Certainly that doesn't flow directly from the enumerated powers in the Constitution. This is coming from a federal agency, which is certainly not an agency that has ever been tasked with doing things like respiratory viruses. And so this is really, really significant. And I think it's a huge mistake, but I'm confident that this is not something that's ultimately going to pass constitutional muster. So we'll stand up for the Constitution, we'll stand up for people's rights, we'll stand up for people's jobs, and I think that you will see this put on hold relatively quickly as these cases start to get filed. And with that, I could take a couple questions. Mike? I think it's a combination. I don't think that as elected officials we can just subcontract out people's freedoms to courts, because courts don't always come through when they need to come through. So we have a responsibility, regardless of what the courts would do, to protect people. But I will say, I think this is so far beyond what we've ever seen before that we get this up in the 11th Circuit. I think we have a very, very high chance of success, certainly in front of the whole court, if we get an en banc hearing. Of course, as you get these panels, it determines what kind of judge you get. You know, you may get different, but I think ultimately we will. I think they'll win in the 5th Circuit. I think we're also seeing challenges in the 6th and the 8th, and I would anticipate that. And I think you're going to see a lot of adverse rulings on this, and it will eventually go to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think that's clear. Yes, sir. Well, our state will not be facilitating this in any respect, of course. I mean, we don't believe it's constitutional. So I think I wouldn't even need to do an executive order, but if I need to, I will, because it just simply goes beyond what the federal government's authority is. And so that's what we'll do. We also want to provide protections for businesses who may get caught in the crosshairs here. We could get this thing enjoined pretty quickly on a preliminary basis. That could happen. So by the time we meet for special session, who knows? It's possible there's action. It's possible that there hasn't been yet. So we will have a responsibility legislatively, but that ultimately is the best power. You know, unilaterally, what you can do, you're limited in executive action. During COVID, when people were using emergency, I mean, I think those powers were abused, but that was the guise of it. Outside of that, you can't do executive orders against society as a whole. And I think that's part of the problem with this, is this is not just applying to government. This is using a totally different subsection of law and authority to try to shoehorn in policy against the broader public. And I think that's why it's ultimately going to go down. But we in Florida, we need the legislature. I mean, they need to come in and they need to do this, because that's how you do it consistent with the rule of law. It's not just executives issuing edicts against society, which are not, whether they're even valid in these emergency, I think it went way beyond what it should have. But clearly, and if you're not in an emergency situation, you don't have the ability to do it. The idea that this is an emergency after most of these people have been working for a year and a half straight. Most of these people, the people in the trucking and logistics and all this stuff, they've kept society going for a year and a half. And now all of a sudden you're saying this is an emergency and that you take 2 months to do the rule, that it's so emergent that you couldn't even just turn this around quickly. So you do it in 2 months, and then you're saying it doesn't apply for another 2 months. That's not emergency. That's them trying to make policy without having to go through the proper channels through the Congress, because they know they wouldn't be able to enact this if they went through the Congress.
You're not calling for the legislature to do a blanket ban on private employers, and you've also appeared to sort of step back from the idea of stripping them of COVID-19 liability protection. There are other things that you have.
When did I step back from that?
It's not in the call. You can't do it without a supermajority vote.
No, it says we're preventing people from being unfairly discriminated. That absolutely could be an appropriate. That's a penalty. That if you discriminate, then you lose. Because some of the private folks will say, "Hey, it's private business. You can do whatever you want." And I say to myself, okay, well, that's weird, because you came to us asking for special protection from COVID liability. We granted that, so if you don't want any of that, then that's fine, you can do that. So that would still be something that I think would be appropriate. I don't think you need to do that, quite frankly. I think you could do it before, but nobody should be fired over this. And so I don't know I think that's pretty blanket to me to say that you shouldn't be fired over this issue, particularly for people that have been working throughout this whole time. The CMS rule also came out. Now we're gonna oppose that as well. That's gonna apply to a lot of the hospital folks, nurses and stuff. If you guys remember, the first people we provided the vaccine to in December were nursing home residents and then healthcare workers. So we were bringing it to these major hospital systems like Jackson and Tampa General, all these places. And some of the nurses declined to do it. Others took it. That was their choice. No one said at the time that they should be mandated to it. Now what you're going to see a situation is they've worked with COVID patients for a year and a half. Many of them have immunity through prior infection. They're going to be told you're going to lose now your job if you don't make this decision that we think is best for you, even though you may not think that. How is that going to help with staffing these facilities when everybody's been short-staffed now for a year and a half? That is going to have a hugely negative effect. Even if it's just a small percentage, you're going to have some serious problems. And so I think that protecting people's jobs from a freedom perspective, certainly vis-a-vis the federal government from a constitutional perspective, but I think just practically, you're going to see all the stuff that's being done. You're going to see it. It's going to cause a lot of friction. It's going to cause a lot of division in our society. It already has. And it is absolutely going to disrupt very key aspects of our economy, from healthcare to logistics, transportation. I mean, we've already seen with these airlines and some of those situations. It's also interesting, if you look at this rule, there are certain exemptions that they put in. They don't apply it, for example, if you work outside. Now, I think that it's clear this thing is not something that's very transmissible outside for whatever reason. But they don't have that same in the federal contractor rule. So is the science different if you're subject to OSHA versus if you're a federal contractor? How come they have so much dissonance about what's in each of these individual rules? That clearly it can't be based on the science then, because the science wouldn't change based on which agency is issuing this. But this is materially different in certain key ways from what the rule for the federal contractors is. And I would imagine if we look at the CMS, we'll be able to find some inconsistencies in those rules as well. So to slop something together and to do this is going to affect tens of millions of Americans, and they're in a situation where they've said, well, you actually can test every week to kind of opt out of this. But they say that the employer doesn't have to pay for it. So you're in a situation where an employee who may not be making that much money, are they going to have to be responsible for doing this? Because if an employer isn't going to pick up the tab, functionally, that is the same as saying that the individual's not going to no longer have their job. So let's just get real here. This is a really significant, this is going to be a significant impediment, I think, to the economy functioning well. Well, we are interested in using some of our resources to potentially provide a defense fund for some of these fines. Like I said, they're not going to be able to enforce this uniformly because you're talking about not every business because they have a 100-employee limit, although they are asking should they do it to the smaller ones too. And I think that would probably come if we were to roll over on this. So I think there's ways that we can create some support to be able to basically pay some of these fines off. I think we can get this thing enjoined in the meantime. But yeah, I mean, we want them to follow Florida law, and we understand if there's conflicts there, we want to smooth those conflicts out. But what we don't want is our law to be jettisoned and people to get fired based off this federal rule. We want to be able to protect the jobs of Floridians and make sure that their livelihoods are intact. And we've had some of the folks with the federal contractor. We had a fellow who's got a business. He's visually impaired. He serves visually impaired people. I mean, his business will just shut down if that's gone in. And there's a whole bunch of stories around about people. And again, they're not recognizing people that have recovered from COVID. They're really not recognizing the full range of health concerns that people may have. And it's like, why are you doing this? And so we're gonna continue to fight it. So I think what I put in the calls, what we're tracking, I haven't seen. I know they're working on stuff. I haven't seen the language, but we don't want people to get fired based off this. We want to protect people's jobs. That's very important, and that's private sector and public sector. Now, the public sector, because we already have prohibitions, we think that that's covered, although we've now had to find some people. So I think we're going to strengthen that to make sure cops, firefighters, that's totally off the table. I mean, it pretty much is. We've been able to fight back on that, but let's just clarify that and make sure. We're going to make sure that if an employer, say they follow the OSHA rule and someone were to lose their job, there obviously will be penalties on the employer for that if they violate our law, but unemployment assistance. You know, at the end of the day, you should be able to get that. If you are injured due to vaccine, then you're eligible for workers' compensation. I think that's something, if the employer is telling you to do this and you do it and then you have an adverse reaction, you obviously, they should have to pick up the tab. So there's a lot of different things in that regard. We are going to also address the Parents' Bill of Rights. I think it was a good piece of legislation, but it wasn't drafted with the understanding that you'd have subordinate government boards like school boards to just say the hell with the law and do whatever they want. And so that's a problem because, you know, the Department of Education took away the school board members' salaries, which I think was appropriate, but at the end of the day, the federal government just sends them more money, and so that wasn't effective teeth. So what you need to do is, if the parent's rights are being violated, then the parent can go in and vindicate that with a private lawsuit, and if they win, they get the attorney's fees against the school board. That's the best way to enforce it, not to have it enforced through some administrative way. So we're going to be seeking that. We're going to make sure that it's clarified exactly what the parents' rights are vis-a-vis these school boards. And of course, you've seen these are huge issues throughout the country because these boards have taken a lot of power away from parents. And in Florida, we really want to be empowering the parent. So we're going to be looking at doing all of those things. I don't know if it's going to be necessary, and I probably not, but I've been very clear about COVID vaccine mandates for school children are not allowed in the state of Florida. We're not going to have that mandated. That is a parent's choice. I think that should flow from the current legislation that's been enacted, SB 2006, as well as the Parents' Bill of Rights. But if there needs to be any clarification on that, because I know a lot of parents have been concerned about potentially being forced to do that, and that's not going to happen. That's a parent's decision. So I think that there's a lot of stuff. And so the question would be is, I think those are, by and large, people agree on that. What are the enforcement? How do you enforce, say, the private employer? Do you have the employee sue? Do you have the attorney general enforce? Do you have some? So those are all things that can be negotiated. But my view is going to be, if someone's been working this whole time, can they keep working or not? And if you're telling me they can't work anymore, then that is not adequate for what we're looking to do to be able to protect people's jobs and to be able to protect people's livelihoods. I mean, this has caused a lot of angst for a lot of people who were going about their business. Many of these people stepped up throughout the whole time, been working in person, would never work from home, and now they're being told all of a sudden that they're not that they're not wanted anymore, or that somehow they can just be cast aside. That's not the way you treat people. We want to make sure we're standing for these folks. We want everybody to be able to work. We want everybody to be able to provide for their family. That's a much stronger state when people have their ability to earn a living than if you're casting some people aside. That's not going to end up helping things very much. So stay tuned tomorrow. We'll have the first filing as soon as the rules publish. Follow that up for a motion to stay at the 11th Circuit. And also, we'll have announcements on the CMS rule. We didn't necessarily anticipate that being published the same time as the OSHA rule, but that has huge ramifications for all these healthcare providers and all these healthcare workers. And we've already seen in different parts of the country, when those mandates have been put in, that's caused huge disruption really across the board. We want to minimize that disruption. Our COVID hospitalizations is probably at a pandemic low now, and we've had, I think, 70 straight days of decline, very low hospital admissions, pandemic low. But as the seasons change, we see how these things go. I've been saying this for 9 months. There's an ebb and flow to this, and so if you start to see admissions increase, hopefully they'll all get the monoclonal antibodies, and then that'll reverse that trend immediately if we start to see it. But if you do see more hospital traffic, everyone needs to be fully staffed. Having that CMS rule in place, especially if it takes place early January when we're likely to see the peak of whatever winter season we see, that's going to make it more difficult. And it's not just about caring for COVID patients. There's all these other ailments that are traditional that we need to make sure that we're supporting the care for as well. So stay tuned for that.